Hello and welcome to Traditional Painting the Digital Way. This is where I use digital painting apps to teach traditional painting techniques. This is part 6 of my Apples in a Hat series, and in this video we're going to continue painting the apples and adding details to them. If you want to follow along with traditional materials, check out part 1 of this series, where I have a list of all the brush, the canvas, and the paints that I use. The app that I'm going to be using is Corel Painter 2019, and I'm using it on my Surface Pro 3. And we're going to go ahead and just continue working on the apples. And so here I'm working on another apple in the shadows. So we want most of our highlights to be reflected highlights, and we want to use darker reds here. And so I'm using sort of an alizarin crimson color if you're following along with your acrylics, and Grumbacher red for the lighter red colors. There's going to be a couple of lighter reflections on this apple. A little bit of some highlight where the sun is hitting it just a tiny bit as it filters through the flowers that are in front of the hat. And so I'm adding a little bit of some orange color there just to give it some variation there in the front. And I'm adding blues and purples also to it, and you can use ultramarine blue or dioxazine purple if you're following along with your acrylic colors. And just kind of following the shape of the texture of the apple here, trying to get the outside shape correct and the shape of the apple that's next to it as well. And then I wanted to add a darker color for the shadows next to the apple, and there might be one more apple there, so I threw in a little bit of red in that shadowed part there, just to make it look like there might be another little apple in there. And I'm adding some darker reds here again, and I'm using the real long bristle or the real flat bristle. Either one of those give you a pretty good dry brush look. And you can use your number 6 flat brush if you're following along with acrylics, and it will give you that feathery look that you want for the texture of the apples here. And then I'm using the blender brush, the Diffuse Blur, and I like to use the Diffuse Blur because it gives you that feathered look, and it looks like you're using a dry brush for the apples there. And so I'm just kind of adding it more to the apple in the shadow, and then I need a little bit of a darker shadow there because the stem is going to be right there for the apple, so you'd add a darker blue or a purple on the apple in the middle, and then you can go ahead and just sort of give it that striped texture for it. Now you're not going to see a lot of detail on that apple either, but you want a little bit of the indication of that striped texture that apples will have. And you can shape the edges of your apple with a darker color, almost a dark brown, but have a little bit of red in it, just to, or at least a little bit of purple, just kind of a warmer color. We want a warmer color. And we're leaving the blue spots in there because those are reflected highlights from the other apples, from the ground, from the hat brim. As I've said in my previous videos, these are not main highlights. These are reflected highlights from other objects next to the apples. And then I'm adding a little bit of purple there along the edge of the hat brim, also in the center of the middle apple to make the apple core, and add a tiny little bit of a highlight. You can use burnt sienna with some white acrylic gesso for these highlights. They're not going to be quite as bright as the ones that are in direct sunlight, but they've got a little bit of some sunlight on them, so they'll be lighter than the reflected highlight there. And you're going to have both on a lot of these apples that are in the shadow. And that just makes your apple look more three-dimensional and makes it stand out and not look like just a flat round blob in the center there. And so here I'm working on the texture of the middle apple, and you can use maybe the pencil or maybe a pastel to just give it kind of a jagged look. And on the stems, we want to highlight the stems with not pure white. We just want some white acrylic gesso with maybe a little bit of burnt sienna or some cadmium orange in them if you're following along with your acrylics. We just want a light brown color, and we want the lines on the stem to be sort of broken. We don't want a solid looking line because the texture on the stems of the apple is rough and sort of woody, so we want it to look natural. We don't want it to look like metal or anything like that. We want sort of a broken line to give it that naturalistic look. And then here I'm working on another apple in the shadow, and I'm adding dark reds and lighter reds there, but we want a little bit of the blue left, or purple, for the reflected highlight as well. And I'm just sort of shaping the apple here and trying to get the apple shape so it doesn't look like a complete round cylinder here. We want kind of a oblong shape like apples are. They're kind of a oval shape, not exactly an oval, and then the top is sort of flat. Anyway, we just want to try to get that look, just to make it look like it's an apple there, and not just a round ball or something. And here I'm adding the stripes on them with a darker color, and I'm running it across the highlights because that gives the texture of the apple and shows that it's got that striped texture on it. And you want that on all of them. And then I'm just working a little bit more on the highlights. And again, in Corel Painter, I'm building up the highlights with different glazes. I just keep going back over it and working and adding more detail and adding texture. Here I'm using the spray brushes to get that texture on the apples and then smearing it, and that gives it a pretty good striped texture. And you can use the pepper spray or whichever, the diffuse spray, whichever one seems to work the best. And you want to just go ahead and sort of put that over all your apples, and you can go back with a red color if you get too much light color, and you just kind of want to get that rough texture look. And then here I'm working on the hat band inside there again, and just making it with a dark brown color, probably burnt umber if you're following along traditionally, and your number 6 flat brush would work if you're following along with traditional paint. And you just kind of want to get a dark brown here and sort of adjust the shape of the hat there and make it look oval. And then again, I want to go ahead and show that there's holes in the crown of the hat because it's a woven straw hat. And I'm using the wild rice brush, which gives kind of a weird pattern, an irregular pattern here, and then using the opaque acrylic just to go across that green color. And if you're following traditionally, you would use phthalo yellow green. And we just want indications of the straw hat. And again, I'm sort of going back inside there and matching up the color just a little bit more, and also working on the brim of the hat and just making it look a little bit more refined and a little bit more oval, and just smoothing that out. And then here in your reference photo, you hit the magnifying glass if you want to enlarge it. But if you want to zoom out, you go ahead and hit Control on your keyboard and then hit the magnifying glass, and that zooms out. And then I wanted to see the highlights on these other apples, and so I'm adding a sort of a light pink highlight here, just trying to get the edge of the apples where the sunlight is hitting them. And if you're following along with your acrylics, you would use Cad Red Light with white acrylic gesso and just get kind of a lighter pink color. This won't quite be the final highlight, but it's getting close. And so I'm just kind of adding those, and those are the ones where the direct sunlight hits on the apples, so they're going to be pretty bright. So this is the end of part 6 of my Apples in a Hat series, and in part 7 we're going to be adding some more final highlights to the apples and also refining the hat and making it look more like a woven straw hat. So if you want to see that, hit the subscribe button, and thanks everybody for watching. Thank you so much for your support. If you have any questions, just leave them in the comments down below, and I will catch you later.